All right. So let's continue from where we left off in the last lecture. Right. So we were trying to show this construction of this uh, existence of fully polynomial time randomized approximation schemes for every problem in Sharpie, in particular for the general problem of counting satisfying assignments of a Boolean formula, right? And we said that it is not possible to, it might not be possible to construct an FP-RAS, but then if you have access to an algorithm that can solve satisfiability, then using that algorithm as a subroutine call, we can actually construct an FP-RAS for satisfiability. For sharp set, right, for counting the satisfying assignments. And the way the algorithm went was the following, right? So we first said that it is sufficient to construct some approximation algorithm, not necessarily a FP-RAS, because if you have some approximation guarantee, then you can construct a new formula and then convert that into an FP-RAS. That was the first step. And then we said that for this constructing this arbitrary for this general approximation algorithm with the guarantee of, say, approximation factor of 64, it is sufficient if you have an algorithm for this gap sat problem. Right? The gap sat is a problem where you're given a Boolean formula and a number k, and you want to check if the number of satisfying assignments is at least some 8 times k or at most k over 8. Right? So there is some gap in the number of satisfying assignments, and you want to know whether there are a lot of satisfying assignments or very few. Okay. And we said that if you have an algorithm for GAPSAT, then you can construct a 64 factor approximation algorithm for counting the number of satisfying assignments. Right. And so till this point, the reduction, the construction is purely deterministic. There is no randomization. And then we said that we will actually construct, we will actually give an algorithm for GAPSAT, which is going to use satisfiability. We are going to use a subroutine call to satisfiability to actually solve the GAPSAT problem, and that will give the final algorithm for the final approximation algorithm for SharpSat. Okay, and to do that, we started out with this lemma about pairwise independent hash family. It tells you that if you take an arbitrary set, suppose the set is large enough, it has a large cardinality, then the number of elements in that set that get mapped to some 0 power m is very close to the expected value, right? Expectation is something like cardinality s by 2 power m, and the with high probability it will be close to that expectation, right? That is what this lemma is saying. And now the reduction is the way in which we are going to finally complete the reduction is so let's see how we will get an algorithm for GAPSAT. Okay, so let me just. Okay. So the algorithm for GAPSAT is the following, right? So suppose you're given, okay, you're given Boolean formula phi and this number k. Right? And you want to check whether what you want to check is whether the number of satisfying assignments is at least 8k or at most k over 8. Right? And we want to use satisfiability in some way, right? So what you do is the following. Okay, so suppose that so the guarantee that we are going, the way we are going to do this is the following. The algorithm we are going to construct will have the following guarantee. It is that if the number of satisfying assignments of phi is at least 8k, then the probability that the algorithm will say algorithm on phi will return a yes is at least half. Okay, and if the number of assignments is less than k over 8, then the probability that your algorithm is going to say no, or it's the probability that it's going to say yes, which is the error probability, is at most 1 over 4. Okay, and what you can say is that even if you have this thing, you can boost this probability, finally boost this with repetition. And this algorithm A is going to use subroutine calls to satisfiability. It'll assume that there is a black box that can solve SAT. Okay, that we will need, that assumption we will need, and this is that this algorithm A is going to use that. Okay? And so how do we do this? So let M be equal to log K, okay? And you construct this pairwise independent hash family from N to M. This is pairwise independent, and N is the number of variables in phi, right? Okay. Now look at the following proposition. This we'll call it as phi prime of x, which is basically phi of x, and h of x is 0 power m, where h is chosen uniformly at random from the pairwise independent hash family. Okay. So what you do is you choose a function h from the uniformly at random from the pairwise independent hash family. Okay, and then you check. Then you write this proposition that this the assignment x bar should satisfy phi, as well as the image of x bar under h is 0 power m. Okay. Now you want to find an assignment x bar which will satisfy phi as well as its image under h is 0 power m. Okay. And what you do is you encode this as a, so this is encoded as a Boolean formula. Okay. This you will be able to do, right? This you can always encode, right? H of x, h is a very explicit function. So you can say h of x bar should be equal to 0 prime as a Boolean function, saying that, it should be these should be the values that it take, and you can just explicitly write it down. Okay, given h. So your algorithm is going to take h uniformly at random from the pairwise independent hash family. Then it's going to write down this new formula phi prime, which is basically phi together with the encoding that the image of x prime under h should be equal to 0 power m. Okay. And then what you do is you will check if phi prime is satisfiable. Right? This is where you're going to use the oracle, the subroutine call to SAT. So you will check whether phi prime is satisfiable, and you answer accordingly. Answer yes or no. That will be your final answer. Right? So you're given phi and the number k. You want to check whether what is the number of satisfying assignments of phi. What you do is you choose this pairwise independent hash family. You construct the pairwise independent hash family HNM, right? And you encode, you construct a new formula phi prime, which is obtained from phi, and by choosing an h uniformly at random from the hash family and encoding the condition, the constraint that h of x bar should be equal to 0 power m. This will give you a new formula, Boolean formula, and you check whether this formula is satisfiable by asking the subroutine. You give a subroutine call to SAT, and if it is yes, you say yes. Otherwise, you say no. Okay. Is this algorithm clear? Any questions on the algorithm? Right. So this is where the randomization is coming in, and this is where you need the subroutine call to SAT. What you want to show is that if there are a lot of assignments, then phi prime will be satisfiable. The probability that phi prime is satisfiable is at least half. And if the number of satisfying assignments is small, then the probability that phi prime is satisfiable is small. That is what you want to prove finally. That will prove the correctness of this algorithm. Any questions so far? Okay. All right. So then let's try to see that. So let's look at the case that the number of satisfying assignments of phi, suppose it is greater than 8k. Okay. So now let S be the set of satisfying assignments. Let S be the set of assignments x bar such that phi of x bar is equal to 1. Yeah. Any questions? Okay. So let this be the set of satisfying assignments. What you know is that the number of satisfying assignments is at least 8k, right? Which is since k m was chosen as log k, this is at least 8 times 2 power m. Okay. So if you look at that lemma, right, that technical lemma about the hash function family, if you are looking at the case where the size of the set S, if the size is greater than 2 power m over epsilon cube, then you have this condition that there are a lot of elements which get mapped to 0 power m, right? Something as it is close to the expectation basically, right? So therefore here we will choose epsilon to be, if you choose this is like this is of the form, this is of the form 2 power m over epsilon cube, right, where epsilon is 1/2, right? So what this tells you is that the probability that the number of x in S such that h of x is the all zero vector, right? The probability that this is greater than 1 minus epsilon cardinality S by 2 power m, right? This is at least 1 minus epsilon, right? This is what this is from that lemma about right, this is this lemma here, right? This part of the lemma, this is greater than 1 minus epsilon, epsilon is half here, right? So if you take apply that lemma, what you get is that this is at least 1 minus epsilon. So here epsilon is half, right? So what it tells you is that probability that x in S, h of x is 0, right? The probability is here is when you take h from this hash function family. Okay? This is at least epsilon is half, so this is half, and cardinality of S is 8 times 2 power m. So the probability of this is at least 4 is at least half, right? And therefore, the probability that your formula phi prime is satisfiable, right? For it to be satisfiable, the probability is that you should have, when is phi prime satisfiable? So according to this construction here, phi prime is satisfiable precisely when one of the original satisfying assignments of phi gets mapped to 0 power m, right? When you choose this h, right? That's when it is satisfiable, right? So for that to happen, what is the probability that one of the x in S is mapped to 0, a string which is 0, all 0 string, right? So therefore, this is definitely greater than the probability that when you sample h, x in S such that h of x is 0, this cardinality is greater than 4, and therefore this is at least half, right? So if the number of satisfying assignments is large, then among the set of assignments, right, with high probability, one of them will get mapped to the all zero vector, right? So therefore, with high probability over the choice of your hash function, the formula phi prime will be satisfied. Is this clear? Any questions regarding this? Yeah. Okay. So that is the first part. So it tells you that if indeed the number of satisfying assignments is large, then the formula that you construct is also satisfiable with high probability. The next step is to say that if the number of satisfying assignments is small, right, then you want to say that the probability that phi prime is satisfiable is less than 1/4, right? Less than or equal to less than. That's the next thing that you want to say. Correct? And so that is again the idea is a similar thing, right? So let's look at the set of satisfying assignments of phi. What you know is that cardinality of S is less than 2 power m divided by 8, right? Yeah. K is, yeah, this is correct. Yeah. So then, what is the probability that phi prime is satisfiable? Right? The probability that phi prime is satisfiable is that when you sample an H, at least one of these X's gets mapped to 0 power m. Right? So this is the probability that when you sample an H from the pairwise independent hash family, there exists an X in S such that H of X is the all zero vector. Right? Which is, so if you take the union bound, this is summation over all X in S. The probability that when you sample an H from the pairwise independent hash family, H of X is the all zero vector. Right? What is this probability? What is that probability? It's 1 over 2 power m, right? It's like uniform. It is uniform. So then this tells you that this is equal to, this is at most, cardinality of S is 2 power m over 8 times 1 over 2 power m. So this is actually even better. It's less than 1 over 8. Right? So the probability that phi prime is satisfiable is just at most 1 over 8. Right? Because the set is small and the image of elements in S is uniformly distributed among the entire range, which has size 2 power n. Right? So the probability that phi prime is satisfiable is 1 over 8. So if you make a query to, so the probability that you will answer yes is just 1 over 8. Your error probability is at most 1 over 8. And now what you do is you'll have to repeat this so that the probability is sufficiently large, because you're going to use this repeatedly in that other construction, right? For your conversion to change your, so the way you're going to apply this, you're going to use the GAPSAT algorithm repeatedly to construct the approximation. So you need to boost the success probability of your GAPSAT algorithm sufficiently large. For that, you have to repeat this multiple times. Right? But this essentially concludes the proof, right? This gives you that FP-RAS for SharpSat with when you have subroutine call to satisfiability itself. Is this clear? Any questions regarding this? Right. So the way to see it is that if you had right, so you have SAT and you have SharpSat. If you knew how to solve SAT, you still won't be able to solve SharpSat. But if you knew how to solve SharpSat, then you can approximate SharpSat. If you knew how to solve SAT, then you can approximate SharpSat very well to as much at to whatever level you want. Right? That is a connection between these two. That is what we have just shown. Is this clear? Any questions? All right. So if you notice whatever you have been doing right now, right, the Monte Carlo method basically is about there is some set that you want to count, right? And what you do is you sample sufficient number of times and look at the fraction of times the points lie in that set, and then you did some sort of counting, right? So both this algorithm, right, both the DNF counting algorithm and even the SharpSat algorithm involved sampling from a suitable set, right? And so it seems like we need the ability to sample from a set and generate samples of some distribution, say uniform distribution, if you want to count, right? And what we will see next is that this is not just the result of one way of analyzing this problem, but rather that generating samples from a set and counting the size of the set are very closely tied together, right? In other words, you can generate samples from a set if and only if you know how to count that set. Right? So if you know how to generate samples from a set, you can count the size of the set. If you can count the size of the set, then you can generate samples from that set. Right? So these two are intimately connected together. So to do counting, you should know how to sample, and to do sampling, you should know how to count. Okay, and this is what we are going to see next, this connection between the two. And the reason we want to do this is that we want to understand this counting problems, right? We want to look at various other counting problems and see how to develop approximation algorithms, randomized approximation algorithms for that. And what we'll see is that the heart of the algorithm is to use this connection and try to show a sampling algorithm from the set that we want to count. Okay, so we will see independent sets, maximum matchings, and so on, perfect matchings, and so on. And what we'll see is that if you know how to sample from the set of independent sets or the set of perfect matchings, then you will also know how to count those sets. And the way in which you're going to sample, we are going to use whatever we learned about Markov chains, right? And we will start with this topic of Markov chain Monte Carlo, right? It's again going to be a Monte Carlo algorithm. We'll see a lot of Monte Carlo algorithms, but not the way in which we saw for SharpSet, which was very direct sort of Monte Carlo, but rather we use Markov chains and their properties to come up with the Monte Carlo algorithm. Right? So that is where we are heading to next. And to understand that, we will start with this nice connection between sampling algorithms, the way algorithms to generate uniform samples from a set and to count a set. Right? That is what we're going to do next. Okay, so for that, okay, let's let's define this notion of a uniform sampling algorithm. What we mean by a uniform sampling algorithm. Okay? So we'll start with this notion of a fully polynomial time approximate uniform sampler. Okay, what is called an FPOS. Okay. So what is an approximate uniform sampler? Okay, suppose that you have some finite sample space. Okay, so let's see what it is. Okay, so let W, okay, be the output of a sampling algorithm. From a finite sample space omega. Okay, so we'll say that the sampling algorithm yeah. Any questions?
So, I'm audible?
Yeah.
I've put a doubt in the chat. Can you just have a look?
Yeah. Okay. The previous the pairwise, the probability is not increasing with epsilon. So let me just go back. So which one?
The one regarding the pair with the set S, which we had with the.
You mean this lemma? Okay.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
Like, shouldn't it be increasing with epsilon the probability that this holds?
If epsilon increases, then what does that mean? So if epsilon increases, you mean as the set becomes larger and larger?
Yeah.
Then you are getting the probabilities 1 minus epsilon, right? As epsilon gets larger and larger, the probability is also large.
Okay. Both sides it's involved. Okay, maybe we'll have to.
So what it's saying is that yeah, as it is larger, you are going to get it more and more concentrated. It's going to be concentrated, really concentrated. Yeah. So maybe that's what you mean. Yeah.
So like both mod S, sorry, the cardinality of S has an epsilon, and again in the bound also using an epsilon. I mean, they're
Yeah. So yeah,
same.
that is true. I think it is possible to state this where you can write cardinality S in terms of some log 1 over delta or something, and that delta will come in the error also. I think that
Okay,
is
yeah,
not,
that's what got
the
it.
statement is not written in the with all the parameters separated out. That's why it looks like this.
Okay.
Right? So it can be 2 to the m over epsilon square with a log 1 over delta and all sitting in there, and then
Okay.
the error will be 1 minus delta, something like that. Right. I think that's the better way to state it, but I've just taken it directly from where it was written. I didn't modify it too much. Yeah. But you will be able to state it in such a way also. You can. There's no reason that the error should depend on epsilon this way. You can make it depend on some delta, and that will come in your the other parameters. Yeah. Okay. Good. Any other questions? Okay. So then let's look at the sampling definition of a fully polynomial time sampler. Okay. So we'll say that a sampling algorithm is set to generate, okay, an epsilon uniform sample of omega if for every S subset of omega, okay, the probability that W is in S minus the uniform case, right, cardinality S over omega, this is at most epsilon. Okay. So W is the output of a sampling algorithm. It's the output of an algorithm. We'll say this algorithm is going to generate an epsilon uniform sample. If the probability, if you take any set that you want, the probability that W lies in that set, right? W is the output of your algorithm. Probability that W lies in your set is like as though you were uniformly sampling from omega. And if you uniformly sample from omega, then the probability that you will hit this element in S is S over omega. And this is saying something like that, right? If you know a little bit more of probability distributions and so on, this is closely tied to what is known as total variation distance. We'll see this later, but this is equivalent definition with respect to total variation distance. Okay, it's not important if you don't know what that is. Okay, we'll just go with this definition. Okay, the equivalence with total variation distance is not necessary right now, but if you know that, then we are talking about total variation distance. So there is an algorithm that is generating some output, right? So it defines a distribution over the sample space omega, right? Your algorithm, and what you're saying is that it is close to as though you are uniformly picking an element from omega. Okay. Now we'll say that the sampling algorithm, is an FP, the fully polynomial time approximate uniform sampler for a problem, for some problem. Okay. If for any input X, okay, and a parameter epsilon greater than 0, the algorithm generates an epsilon uniform sample from omega of X. So think of it this way, right? So X is your input and omega of X is the set that you're interested in, right? For instance, if X is as a Boolean formula, then omega of X is your set of satisfying assignments. If X is a graph, then omega X could be the set of perfect matchings in that graph. Or it could be that omega X is a set of independent sets in the graph, right? So given an input, you have an associated sample space and you want to generate a uniform sample from that, right? So given S, you're looking at basically the solution. You can think of it as a solution space for this input. If it's a Boolean formula, then it's if you're looking at satisfiability, then the solution space is a set of all satisfying assignments. If you're looking at the independent set, then the input is a graph and omega x is a set of all independent sets. If the input is a graph and you're looking at perfect matchings, then omega of x is a set of all perfect matchings. Right? So it outputs an epsilon uniform sample from that set, and in time, polynomial in the size length of x and log 1 over epsilon. Okay. So if you have a sampling algorithm which can generate this sample in time, which is polynomial in x and log 1 over epsilon, right? Then you say that the sampling algorithm is a fully polynomial time approximate uniform sampler. Okay. Is this definition of an approximate uniform sampler clear? Right. So in the case of, say, independent set, which is the way in which you're going to state the connection right now. Say, for instance, you're looking at independent sets in a graph, then what you can say is that this algorithm will take the graph, right? So, and in time log 1 over epsilon, it's going to output an independent set. And the probability that it will, given a fixed independent set, the probability that it will output that independent set is like as though it is 1 over the cardinality of all independent sets, right? As though it is uniform. Okay. Is this clear? Any questions regarding this statement, this definition? Right. So what we're going to see is that this connection, right? All these counting algorithms being about sampling, right? It's no coincidence. It is that if you want to do counting, then you need to know how to sample. Right. That is what we are going to see next. It's a very nice theorem. It tells you, so we'll state it in a very specific setting. We'll just state it for independent sets. We'll see it for, say, perfect matchings also later, for colorings and so on. But let's state it in this form for independent set. Okay. So what does it say? It tells you that there is a fully polynomial time approximate uniform sampler for independent sets and graphs if and only if there exists an FP-RAS for counting the independent sets, for counting independent sets and graphs. Right. So the fact that your algorithms for FP-RAS were all doing sampling is it's not that you can avoid it and do something else and get a different algorithm. But if you could sample, then you can do construct an FP-RAS, and if you construct an FP-RAS, then you know how to sample also. Right. So these are very closely tied together. Okay. And the fact is that this is not actually, it has nothing to do with it's not just about independent sets, but what you actually need to state this theorem is that you need to look at what are called self-reducible problems. And for any such self-reducible problem, this theorem holds. So this theorem can be stated in a very general form for arbitrary self-reducible problems. Just that we will not do it because it will make the discussion quite abstract. But you can look at the paper and you'll see that this is actually holds for any self-reducible problem. Right? So what is a self-reducible problem? Okay. So SAT, independent set, matchings, all of these are self-reducible problems. The reason it's self-reducible is the following. Right? Why is it called self-reducible? Suppose you take sharp SAT. Okay. So the idea of self-reducible is that if you want to solve a problem, you can actually you can construct two smaller instances of the problem from the same problem, and then solve these problems and then just combine them. You are reducing solving this problem to solving the same problem on a smaller instance obtained from this original instance. Okay. So that is, if your problem has that property, then it is known as a self-reducible problem. So for instance, suppose you want to do sharp SAT. Okay? You want to count the satisfying number of satisfying assignments in SAT. So you're given a formula phi. There are n variables, right? What you can say is the following, right? The number of satisfying assignments of phi with these variables x1, x2 to xn is same as assign the truth value 1 to the variable x1 and look at the formula, count the number of satisfying assignments, and add it to the form, add it with the number of satisfying assignments of the formula with x1 set to 0. Right? Every truth assignment for phi must set x1 to some truth value. Look at all satisfying assignments for phi which set the truth value, the first variable to 1. Look at all satisfying assignments which set the first variable to 0. Add them up, and what you have is your answer for the number of satisfying assignments for phi. So if you knew how to solve the smaller instances, then that is sufficient to solve this larger instance. This is what is being captured by self-reducibility. Right? You're solving SharpSat, but you're saying that to solve SharpSat, it's sufficient to solve SharpSat on the smaller instances that you're going to get. Okay. Any questions regarding this? Is this notion of self-reducibility clear? And you will see the self-reducibility as when we try to prove this statement for independent sets. So let's see what is the self-reducibility for independent sets. No? So let's look at independent sets. So what is an independent set? So if you are given a graph G, right, an independent set I is a subset of V such that for every U and V in I, there is no edge between U and V. Right? So if you have a graph, some arbitrary graph, right, you look at vertices that have no edges between them. Right? For instance, this is one, this is one. Right? You cannot put anything else. Right? This is an independent set. If you try to add anything more to it, then it will no longer be an independent set. Right? So an independent set in a graph is just a bunch of vertices. They are all which are not connected to each other. Okay. So now suppose you want to count the number of independent set. Okay. So you're given this graph G. You want to count the number of independent sets of graph G. Can you tell me what is the self-reducibility property for independent sets? Independent sets are also self-reducible. Can you tell me what is the property? Yeah.
You can take some random vertex and like all the independent sets which contain that vertex and that which do not contain that vertex.
Exactly. Right. So what you do is you choose a vertex V. Okay. Now you look at the two things can happen, right? The first is that V is in your independent set, and the other is that V is not in your independent set. Okay. If V is in your independent set, then what do you need to do? You need to look at the new graph G prime, which is basically G minus V minus the neighbors of V. Right? Because if I take a vertex and put I put V into the independent sets, then I know that none of its neighbors can also be in the independent set. So I take V, I throw away V and the neighborhood of V, and then I say what is the number of independent sets in G prime. Okay? If V is not in I, all I need to do is I get G double prime, which is basically G minus V. Right? So if I want to count the number of independent sets of G, all I need to do is to count the number of independent sets of G prime and the number of independent sets of G double prime. Correct? So this is the self-reducibility that is present. Right? So perfect matchings also has such property. We'll come to that when we study perfect matching. So this is what self-reducibility is. Right? Now you can state this state self-reducibility in a very abstract general form, and the theorem that we are going to see is actually applicable to any self-reducible problem, right? Not just independent sets and so on. Right? As long as you know how to sample, then that is necessary and sufficient for constructing an FPRS for the counting problem. Any questions? Okay. So then let's look at this. Let's prove this theorem. Let's prove the one direction. Let's prove this direction, which tells you that if you have a sampler, then you can construct a FPRAS. Right. This is the way in which we have been seeing. Right. We have been using sampling to do counting. Right. We saw in Sharp DNF, even the SharpSat, and so on. So let's see how you will do this in this general setting for independent sets. Right? And the idea is that you'll see this similar idea can be extended into more general settings. Right? Okay. So let's do the following, right? So you have the idea is the following, right? So you have a graph G, okay? And you first order the edges, okay, in some way. Say E1, E2 up till EM, okay? And let's call omega of G. Right? This is what we are interested in. This is the set of independent sets. Right? And we want to find the cardinality of the set. Right? So what we'll do is we'll start the following, right? We'll start removing edges from this graph one at a time, and we will try to compute independent sets for the smaller graphs. Okay, and the idea is the following. Right? So suppose you want to look at the number of independent sets of graph G. So let's start with GM. Okay, so in particular, what you have is GI is a graph where edges, where the first, where you have removed M minus I edges. Okay, in this order. So for instance, you start with G, which is GM. Okay. Now what you do is you remove E1, in which case you'll get GM minus 1. Now you remove E2, you get GM minus 2, and so on. Okay. Finally, what you have is G0, which is the empty graph. Right. This is the empty graph with no edges. Okay. Now the idea behind this algorithm is the following. Suppose you want to find the number of independent sets in G. You look at this product, okay, sort of telescoping product, which is the number of independent sets in GM divided by the number of independent sets in GM minus 1 times omega GM minus 1 divided by omega G M minus 2, and so on till omega G1 divided by omega G0 times omega G0, cardinality omega G0. Right? Because G is equal to GM, so all these terms just cancel out. They keep cancelling out, and this equality, you know, right? And what you know is that what is this cardinality? How large is this? What is the number of independent sets in the empty graph?
2 power n.
Right there. Yeah, that's 2 power n, right? So every subset is an independent set. Correct? So what we are going to do is that we are going to take this equation, and what we are going to do is that we are going to approximate each of these quantities. Okay. Each of these ratios we are going to approximate. Yeah, yes, Arthur, yes, 2 power n. Yeah. So we are going to approximate each of these quantities, and then we want to show that this is sufficient to approximate omega G. Okay. So in particular, what you have is, so let's let's look at some properties, right? So if you look at the independent sets of gi and gi minus 1, what can you say about these sets? Which is a larger set? Which is a superset?
gi minus 1.
Right? gi minus 1 is a superset, right? Because gi contains the gi minus 1 was obtained by removing one edge, right? So all the independent sets that were there in gi are also independent sets in gi minus 1, right? Because you have obtained gi minus 1 by removing an edge. So whatever independent set was there in gi would have been there in gi minus 1. Possibly you can have more independent sets because you have removed an edge, right? So here what you have is you have a ratio where the set of independent sets of gi is contained in the set of independent sets of gi minus 1, right? So if you notice, this fits into your the Monte Carlo framework, right? So what do you need to do, right? If you want to estimate this ratio, it fits very well into the Monte Carlo framework, the way it's written, right? First is that if you want to estimate a ratio, say, so let me just write it. Suppose you want to estimate, what do you want to estimate? You want to estimate omega gi divided by omega gi minus 1, right? Now the Monte Carlo method tells you that to do this, you need a few things. The first is that you need to sample from omega gi minus 1. But this is exactly what your assumption is giving, right? You have this approximate. You don't have an exact sampler, but you have an approximate uniform sampler. So you can sample from the set that you want, right? That you need that. Secondly, you need to check. So given a sample I in omega gi minus 1, which is an independent set, check if I is in omega gi. That is easy, right? If you give me an independent set in gi minus 1, I can check whether it is an independent set in gi, because I know which is the edge that was removed. I can easily check which is whether it's an independent set in gi minus 1. That is also possible, right? And finally, what do I need? I need to say that the set gi, right? This set is sufficiently large inside gi minus 1. Only then will you actually get some sample, right? I mean, if the set omega gi is very, very small, then you will not get anything, right? You might sample. It's the same problem with the sharp DNF, right? When you sample uniformly at random from the set of all satisfying all assignments, if the number of satisfying assignments is very small, you will hardly see anything. Similarly, if the set of independent sets in omega gi is very small compared to the set of independent sets in omega gi minus 1, then you will not be able to sample this. You will not be able to estimate this ratio with a small number of samples, right? So if these things happen, so in fact, if these things happen, then we can check whether there are ways to set the parameters in suitable way so that you can estimate each of these ratios, and using these ratios estimate the entire set of the size of the independent set. Okay, and that's what we are going to see, that it's actually possible to do all this. Right? 1 and 2 we know how to do. One is given by the assumption, which is that you have a fully polynomial time approximate uniform sampler. 2 follows because given an independent set, you can check whether it's also an independent set in a slightly larger graph. The third one is what you want to prove first. That we don't know whether it's true or not, and that's what we'll first prove. Any questions so far? Okay, so let's see why this is true, right? Why is it that this is fairly large? Okay, so let's just state this small lemma. So it tells you that for any I, right, omega size of the independent sets in gi and gi minus 1, this ratio is at least half. It's very good, right? If you really sample, then you will hit this very well, these independent sets quite well. Right? There's a very large, uh, out of all the independent sets in GI minus 1, a large fraction of them are actually independent sets of GI also. Right? It's also not very hard to see. Right? So suppose you look at let's look at the simple proof for this. Okay? So let UV be the edge, right? That was removed. From GI to obtain GI minus 1. Okay. What can you say about the independent sets of GI minus 1 and GI? Is there something that you can say? For instance, what are the independent sets in GI minus 1 that are not in independent sets of GI? How will such independent sets look like?
Those that contain both the U and V.
Exactly, right? Yeah, as Sarthak is saying and Srikanth is saying, these are precisely independent sets that contain both U and V. Right? Why? Because if you take an independent set, so G, you can think of it like this, right? So you have the graph, and there is this one edge, which is the edge that is there. So this, when you remove this orange edge, is when you get when this goes out, you get GI minus 1, right? And this is the graph G, right? The white thing with the orange edge is GI, right? So take any independent set of GI minus 1. If it contains U but it does not contain V, then it also is an independent set of GI. Right? Because the only edge that was removed from GI to obtain GI minus 1 was that edge UV. Right? So the only way that you have an independent set in GI minus 1 which is not there in GI is because you put both U and V into it. Right? U and V has no edge in GI minus 1, so you actually put it, but that cannot be an independent set in GI. Right? So that is the case. So the number of independent sets in GI minus 1 is the set of all independent sets in GI, right, plus the set of all independent sets in GI minus 1 that are not in GI. Right? But what can you say about this set? How large can the set be is what you want to say. Right? If you see the statement of the lemma, what you want to show is that this is at most omega GI. Right? This is what you want to show. Because that is what you need to prove the lemma. Okay. Why is that true? Okay. So what we can show is that there exists an injective map. To show this, it's sufficient to show that there exists an injective map from the set of independent sets in G omega in G minus 1 minus GI, right, to the set of independent sets in GI. Can you tell me what this injective map will be?
Take any independent set in that GI minus 1 minus GI.
Yeah.
So from that, if you remove U, it will be an independent set in GI.
Exactly. Right. Take the independent set. Take an independent set here. So this will contain both U and V, which means that all the neighbors of U and neighbors of V are not present. Just remove one. Say you fix U, right? Remove U from it, and then what you get is an independent set in GI. Okay. This is definitely an injective map, right? If you take two different independent sets in GI minus 1 minus GI, then they will not map to the same independent set, right? Because the sets in which they differ are some other vertices other than U and V, right? take two different independent sets in omega gi minus 1 minus omega gi, both of them will contain u and v. So the only vertices in which they're different are some other vertices, and they will remain different in omega gi also by this process. So it's an inductive, there's an injective map from the set of independent sets in gi minus 1 minus omega gi to omega gi. Right? And existence of injective map implies that this is the larger set. And therefore, this proves the lemma. Right? So this is the sum is at most 2 times omega gi, and therefore the set of independent sets in gi is fairly large. At least half of the independent sets in gi minus 1 are actually independent sets of gi. Right? Is the statement clear? Any questions?
Sir, I have a doubt. Like, can't we make like a stronger statement like the difference of gi minus 1 and gi is at most half of omega of gi?
Is at most half of
Omega of gi. Because like if you take any independent set in that different set,
okay.
Like if you remove u, you get an independent set in gi, and if you remove v also, you get an independent set in gi.
Okay.
And both those independent sets are distinct sets.
Okay, but isn't it can okay? Both of them are independent sets. Okay. So you're saying there's a what sort of map? You're saying 2 to 1. Is it? What is it you're saying?
Yeah, like there's a function which will map any independent set in that difference to two distinct independent sets in GA.
Okay. So you're basically say you want to think about your instead of it's not a function anymore. It's a sort of a multi. It's like if you want to think of it as like a graph with two neighbors for each independent set in gi minus 1 minus gi. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, like
okay.
Okay, I'll think about this later.
Okay. Okay. So you might be able to get a slightly better constant also. That is also possible. Right? I don't know exactly, but yeah, maybe you can just think about it. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so then I guess we have most of the things that we need to do this. Just we just need to see how to put everything together, right? What is the how does everything? How can we put everything together? That's all what we need. Okay. So what we're going to do is that we want to estimate these quantities Ri, which is omega gi divided by omega gi minus 1. Right? And what we know is that cardinality of omega g is 2 power n times the product of Ri's. Right? And we want to estimate these Ri's by Ri tildes, right? Some good approximation. And what we want to show is the following, right? So if you take R, capital R, to be this ratio, I going from 1 to m, Ri tilde by R, right? You want this to be as close to 1 as possible, right? So if R minus 1 is less than or equal to epsilon, right? What it means is that product of I equal to 1 to m Ri tilde minus product of I is equal to 1 to mr, right? This is less than or equal to epsilon times product I is equal to 1 to nr. And therefore, this quantity 2 power n I equal to 1 to m ri tilde, which is your estimate, will be actually close to your set size of the set of independent sets, and the error will be at most epsilon times, right, omega g. So if you can estimate this r well, then that would imply this bound, right? So this would imply that 2 power n product ri tilde lies between 1 minus epsilon cardinality omega g and 1 plus epsilon cardinality omega g. That will give you the approximation that you want, right? And so all we need to do is to approximate this quantity. And to do that, we need an approximation for Ri tildes. How good an approximation do you need for Ri tildes for this to happen? Okay. So that is what this next lemma is stating, right? If you have, if it is possible, if there is an algorithm that with probability at least 1 minus delta approximates for every I, if there exists an algorithm that approximates Ri to an error of epsilon over 2m with probability at least 1 minus delta over m, right? Then you also have an algorithm that approximates R within an error of epsilon with probability at least 1 minus delta, right? So you need these RIs, each of these RIs to be approximated within this level of approximation. Okay, and these RIs are the ones that we are going to approximate using our Monte Carlo method. Okay, and this lemma that is written here is not very hard to see, right? So what it tells you is that, what does this statement mean here? It means that for every I, right, the probability that Ri minus Ri tilde, probability that this is greater than epsilon over 2m Ri, right? This is at most delta over m. Okay. So then, so this is true for every I. So then with probability at least 1 minus delta, right? For every I, we have that sorry, let me just revert. Right? So for each I, we know that this error is going to be at most this thing, right? So this means that Ri minus Ri tilde, right, is at most epsilon over 2m Ri, right, for every I, with probability at least 1 minus delta, right? So you have, it's just a union bound. This is just a union bound. Correct. And then this tells you what, this gives you what you want, right? So this tells you that Ri tilde minus Ri, which is what you want, right? Ri tilde minus Ri lies between 1 plus epsilon over 2m, 1 minus epsilon over 2m and 1 plus epsilon over 2m, right? It lies between these two. And then your R is nothing but product of Ri tilde divided by Ri. Right? So then you can just multiply this out, and it will be 1 minus epsilon over 2m raised to m That's the lower bound, and 1 plus epsilon over 2m raised to m. And then you can just use your standard inequalities and get the bound that you want. Right? So to approximate R, you need to approximate these Ri's, which is where we are going to use the Monte Carlo method, to this level of approximation. Yeah. Any questions? Okay. So next, what we want to show is that indeed we can do this, right? The real Monte Carlo method that we're going to use now, right? So what we want to show is that, so fix an I. Right? So there exists this algorithm. That outputs Ri tilde such that the probability of Ri minus Ri tilde, the probability that this is greater than epsilon over 2m is at most delta over 2m, delta over m. Right? Okay. And here what we do is basically the following, right? We use our approximate uniform sampler to sample from GI. You check whether it is in GI minus 1 and you increment the counter, right? So this is the Monte Carlo. Now this is Monte Carlo simulation. The algorithm is the Monte Carlo algorithm. Right? So what you do is you have the counter C, right, which is initially 0. And then you repeat some m times. We'll see what m should be. Right? Repeat m times. What you do is you generate I from the independent set of GI minus 1 using the parameter that you require here is, I think, an epsilon over 6m uniform sampler. Right? So this is where you're using the fact that there is a fully polynomial time approximate uniform sampler. So you generate this I, check if I is in G omega GI, then you increment the counter. Right? You just increment that counter and you return C divided by M. Right? The standard Monte Carlo algorithm. Right? We just need to check what should this M be so that this will work out fine. Right? Any questions? Okay. So we know that we will get a lot of, the M is not going to be large because we are going to get a lot of samples, right? Because you know that GI minus 1 is, GI is fairly large inside GI minus 1. Right? Within 2, if you actually do 2 steps, you are likely to see one of them being independent sets in GI in expectation. Okay. So the analysis is also not very difficult, right? So I think so the analysis is it's a little more lot of arithmetic. I think I'll just leave that algebra. It's mostly algebra. It's not anything complicated, right? So I'll stop for now, in fact, because to do all that algebra will take some time, right? But there's nothing complicated in that algebra, right? So the idea is to look at the following. So what does it mean to say that you have a uniform? So let's look at one sample, right? So the idea is just this, right? Take the kth sample, okay, and let xk be equal to 1 if kth sample is in omega gi. Right? That's typically how you start, right? So what you know is that since your samplings, right, since you're getting samples uniformly at random from an FPAUS, you know that omega gi is a subset of omega gi minus 1. So the definition can be applied to this particular set here. So what you know is that the probability that xk is equal to 1, right? This probability that xk is equal to 1 is very close to the ratio omega gi divided by size of omega gi minus 1. This is from the definition of the sampler. This is at most epsilon over 6m. Right? This is the standard, this is just the definition. The fact that you have a fully polynomial time approximate uniform sampler. Right? Because it works for any set S, which is a subset of the set from which you are sampling. And this is particularly saying that what is the probability that the sample that you just generated was actually inside that set S. Right? And since it's an indicator random variable, this I can write it as saying probability that this is the expected value of xk, right? Minus omega gi by omega gi minus 1. This is at most epsilon 6m. And then all these xk's are distributed in the same way, right? They have the same distribution. So you can actually take some sort of a sum, right? So you can say that this is this expectation of 1 over m summation xi, I going from 1 to capital M, minus omega gi by omega gi minus 1. Right? This is at most epsilon over 6m. Okay. So what this is actually telling you is the following, right? What is this quantity? This is actually the expected value of Ri tilde. Right? Ri tilde is the is the estimate that you're building, right? And this is the expected value of Ri tilde, right? Because you're doing, this is the sum that you're this xi is sum of xi is basically the value c, right? So this is the expected value of Ri tilde. And what is saying that this expected value of Ri tilde is actually close to Ri. Right? That's what this is telling. Similarly, you can use your Chernoff bound also to say that expected value of Ri tilde is also close to Ri. Ri tilde. Okay, this also is going to be small. It depends on how many samples you're taking and so on. Right? This is also something that you can show. And then it's just about combining both of these things together with suitable algebraic manipulation to show that this will imply that Ri minus Ri tilde is small. Right? So that part I think you can just read from the book. Right? I'll give you, it's from the chapter 11 of the book. You can just read it. Right? There is nothing complicated, right? So you're showing two things. One is that the expected value of Ri tilde is close to Ri tilde because you're taking sufficient number of samples. That's the Chernoff bound. And this calculation shows you that expected value of Ri tilde is also close to Ri. Therefore, Ri tilde and Ri itself must be close to each other. Right? That's the analysis. Okay. So that brings us to a close regarding this connection between sampler and FP-RAS. So there is also, it goes the other way. We'll briefly see that in the next class, that given a randomized approximation scheme, you can construct a sampler also. Right? And that we will see briefly in the next class. And then we will go ahead and try to use this to actually design randomized algorithms for counting problems. Okay? So we will see, we'll try to, the way it's going to work is that we are going to look at the graph problem, say independent set problem or say a perfect matching problem. And we will try to construct a Markov chain whose stationary distribution will be the uniform distribution over the set of all independent sets. Okay? We will prove that here is a Markov chain, and we'll prove that this Markov chain stationary distribution is a set of all independent sets of the graph. And then after that, we will see methods to show that these Markov chains converge to the stationary distribution very fast. In polynomial number of steps, we'll show that in polynomial number of steps, these Markov chains converge to the stationary distribution. Right? So to construct the sampler, what you need to do is just run this Markov chain for polynomial number of steps, and then use this connection between samplers and approximation algorithms to construct the FP-RAS for the counting problem. Okay. So that we will do in the next class. So that's in the next part of the course. So so there's no lecture on Monday and Wednesday. We next meet on Thursday. Right? Same time. Any questions? So I was supposed to give out an assignment today, I think, or 15th. Tomorrow I was supposed to give. So that I will not give. Instead, I'll give you the